This video series is all about modern web development practices. And as part of the modern web, we don't always want to render data in the typical request-response fashion that outputs formatted HTML. Often we'll want to return JSON, or maybe even XML, or an Acrobat PDF file, plain text, or a custom format of some kind. Being able to marshal your data into various formats is built into the CoalBox framework, and this can be done several different ways. Here's our user list page that we've been working from before, or the event handler for it anyway. You can see the handler just stuffs our query into the PRC scope, and that's picked up in our view page, the same as it was before. Now watch what happens when we add this return statement into our handler, where it says return prc.qry users. That was not in the earlier version of our event handler. When we do that in the browser, you can see it actually returns JSON representing that query. It doesn't do any of the layout stuff that we had in our site header and footer is completely gone. It's just returning the results of that query, but it's not returning them as, say, a CF query tag or a ColdFusion CF dump statement. It's actually formatting it out as JSON for us right there in the browser, simply by doing that return statement that we have on line 39. This ability to return data as JSON simply by adding a return statement in your handler is incredibly useful. For example, you could have one handler that renders a traditional HTML layout in your application, and have a second handler that also calls our user model component, returns that data, and poof, you've got the beginnings of a JSON API to power, say, a Vue.js front end, or maybe a mobile application of some kind. There are a few other architecture and security concerns you should consider before doing this in production, but the main takeaway here is you can get a lot of extra functionality from CoalBox without having to write very much code at all. You can power a traditional HTML web app and power an API for your mobile applications from basically the same code. What if we wanted some other type of output besides JSON? And there are several ways you can do that. The event.renderData function will convert data into various formats for you. Here we've got our query being turned into plain HTML. In this case, plain HTML probably isn't super useful. It's not formatted well for human readability, as you can see here, and it's not a standard format to be used for something like JSON, or how JSON would be used to power an application like a mobile app or an API or anything like that. Plus, to get to our query and have it actually work with the renderData method, we had to use the .toString method, so there was a little bit of extra work here, and while this code ran, there are probably some better options. In the second example we have, you can see we're using type equals XML. There's no toString method attached on here, and our data is now in a very readable format, as you'll see over here in this demo. Refresh the page, and now our data is coming back in XML, which is both human readable and well structured and formatted for things like a web service or an API to be able to use. So we've been able to convert our data to JSON, HTML, and XML, either from doing the return statement that we had earlier, or by using event.renderData and just passing in the query doing .toString that will format it as HTML. We can also use event.renderData to format it in XML simply by doing type equals XML and passing the query in here. And you can also use event.renderData to output the data as JSON, the same way we did it with the return statement earlier. Event.renderData type equals JSON does the exact same thing as the return statement we looked at the beginning of this code demo. The only reason you would use one versus the other is maybe consistency. If you have other event handlers that do render data and you want to be consistent, you can use it also for formatting your JSON output, like so. Any of them will work. They do the exact same thing. Instead of calling the event.renderData method like we have here, we can also use that return statement we saw earlier and combine it with a component annotation, and we'll get the same results. I'm going to say return prc.qry users, and that by default, we'll reload the page, gives us the JSON that we saw before. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here to my list function, and over here next to the method signature, I'm going to say renderData equals XML. Save that, come back here and reload our page, and now we get the XML formatting that we got from calling event renderData with type equals XML. So I can use that return statement style syntax that we saw originally that returned JSON, and simply by adding this component annotation to the method here, renderData equals XML, it's now returning XML for me. I can switch that from XML to JSON, reload the page, and I'll get JSON as my output. I can also come in here and change that render data to text, reload it, and I get the output of that view in plain text formatting. In addition to XML, JSON, plain text, and HTML, I can return JSON-P, Acrobat PDF files, or even custom formats of my own choosing, and a lot more. You can get a complete list of all the formats available, plus instructions on how to use custom data formats from the Coldbox Ordersbooks website. In addition to XML, JSON, plain text, and HTML, you can return JSON-P, Acrobat PDF files, or even custom formats of your own choosing. A complete list of the formats available, plus instructions on how to use custom data formats, can be found here on the coldbox.ordersbooks.com website under the documentation for rendering data.